The Dniester Valley was cold and still in the early hours of June 20th, 1624, with mist sitting low on the water and the kind of silence that only exists when thousands of men are holding their breath at the same time. On the eastern bank, a Tatar horde of thousands moved south through the grey morning light. Horses, riders, and somewhere in the middle of it all, roped lines of Polish and Ruthenian captives who had been walking for days toward the slave markets of Crimea. The horde was heavy with plunder, slowed by everything it had taken, and its commanders believed the worst was behind them. The river was close, home was close. They had not yet looked carefully at the hills on the western bank. Up there, in the quiet above the ford, 5,000 Polish soldiers were waiting, outnumbered, hidden, and completely still. Their hetman had spent 3 years in a Turkish dungeon, thinking about exactly this moment, and he had designed every piece of what was about to happen with one purpose: make the enemy walk into a trap they could not see until it had already closed around them. What happened next in this valley would not be forgotten for 100 years. Stay with me. June 20th, 1624, early morning, somewhere in the Dniester River valley in what is now western Ukraine. The mist is still sitting on the water. The hills on the western bank rise steeply from the river's edge, covered in grass and scattered scrub, and from the high ground you can see a long way down the valley in both directions. It is the kind of morning that feels calm before you notice what is moving through it. And something is moving. Coming from the north, from the direction of the Polish interior, a column stretches back farther than you can comfortably count. Thousands of horses, riders in light armour, curved bows strapped across their backs, spare mounts running alongside. And between the horses, roped together in lines, are people, men, women, children. Farmers from Galician villages, townspeople from the borderland settlements. They have been walking for days, roped at the wrist to the person ahead of them and behind, moving south toward the Dniester crossing at the village of Martynów, and beyond that toward the slave markets of Crimea. This is a Tatar raiding horde on its way home. And it is enormous. By some contemporary accounts, somewhere around 15,000 riders, though historians have argued the real number was likely lower. Whatever the precise figure, it dwarfs the force watching it from the hills. Because on the high ground above the valley, spread across the ridgeline in what looks from a distance like loose and uncertain formation, are roughly 5,000 soldiers of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Hussars with lances, Cossack cavalry, light horse, infantry with cannons arranged in a fortified wagon formation, noblemen who answered the levy, and one man who had planned all of this in some detail from the moment he learned this horde was turning back south. 5,000 against at minimum 3 times that number, quite possibly 4 times. On paper, this should not be a contest. By the end of the day, the valley near Martynów will be covered in Tatar dead. The river crossing will be a scene of drowning horses and fleeing riders. The captive column will be cut loose and freed, and the commander of that horde will be riding south, wounded, his authority inside the Crimean Khanate permanently damaged by what happened here. For the first time in 100 years, a Polish commander had not just slowed a Tatar raiding force, he had destroyed one. This is how he did it. To understand what happened at Martynów, you need to understand the world that produced it. And that world, in the early 1620s, was one of the most militarily exhausted corners of Europe. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1624 was a vast political entity, stretching from the Baltic coast down through what is now Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, and large parts of Ukraine. It was the largest state in Europe by territory for much of the 17th century. It had a parliament, the Sejm, made up of the nobility. It had two supreme military commanders, the Grand Hetman and the Field Hetman, appointed by the king. It was, by the standards of the time, sophisticated and powerful. It had also just barely survived the previous 4 years. In 1620, the Ottoman Empire had gone to war with the Commonwealth over control of Moldavia. That war opened with a catastrophe. At the Battle of Chikora in September of that year, the combined Ottoman and Tatar army shattered the Polish force. Grand Crown Hetman Stanisław Żółkiewski, the greatest Polish commander of his generation, was killed during the retreat. His head was taken as a trophy to Constantinople. The field hetman, a man named Stanislaw Koniecpolski, was captured and taken in chains to the Castle of the Seven Towers in Istanbul, where he would sit for the next 3 years. The following year, 1621, the Ottomans came back with a far larger force. Estimates range from 100,000 to 250,000 men, under the personal command of Sultan Osman II. The Commonwealth scraped together its army and its Cossack allies and met them at the Dniester fortress town of Kotin. The resulting siege and battle lasted weeks, cost enormous casualties on both sides, and ended in a negotiated stalemate. No territory changed hands. But the Ottomans went home, and Poland did not collapse. The Treaty of Kotin in October 1621 brought peace of a sort. The borders stayed where they were. The Commonwealth agreed to rein in Cossack raids into Ottoman territory, and the fragile frontier along the Dniester and into the Ukrainian steppe settled back into its normal condition, which was not peace, but rather a lower-intensity, permanent war. Because the Crimean Tatars were always there. The Crimean Khanate was, formally, a vassal of the Ottoman Sultan. In practice, it operated with considerable independence, particularly when it came to raiding into Commonwealth territory. And raiding was not an occasional disruption. It was the economic foundation of Crimean society. The slave trade was how the Khanate funded itself. Captives taken in Poland, Ukraine and Russia were marched to the port city of Kaffa on the Black Sea, where they were sold into the Ottoman slave markets and beyond. Historians estimate that more than 1 million people were taken from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth's territories between 1500 and 1644 alone. In some regions of what is now western Ukraine, 1/3 of all villages were devastated or simply abandoned between 1578 and 1583. This was not occasional violence. This was the systematic depopulation of an entire frontier zone across generations. The mechanics of a Tatar raid were well established and very effective. A raiding horde would move fast, living off the land and their spare horses. They travelled in large formations that could split into smaller groups once they entered populated territory. One group fixing attention at one border crossing, while the main body struck somewhere else entirely. They used false intelligence, dummy riders on spare horses to inflate apparent numbers, and deliberate rumour spreading to confuse the defence. Once in populated territory, groups of several hundred would fan out across the countryside, surrounding villages at night with fires so no one could escape in the dark. Then they would burn, take everything of value and rope the able-bodied survivors together for the march south. A Tatar horseman travelled light. A sabre, a composite bow, a quiver of 18 to 20 arrows, a knife, a rope, 10 or 12 yards of it, to bind captives, 2 or 3 spare horses. That was his logistics. He could cover extraordinary distances in a short time, and he needed almost nothing that he could not find along the route. The tactical weakness of this system only appeared when the horde was on its way home. Loaded with captives and looted cattle and plundered goods, a returning horde moved significantly more slowly than the force that had gone in. The Jasir column, the roped captives, required guards and management. Livestock needed to be driven, and eventually the horde needed to cross the Dniester, which meant funneling through one of a limited number of fordable crossings. This was the vulnerability, and the man who had just been ransomed from a Turkish dungeon understood it better than almost anyone alive. Stanislaw Koniecpolski came back to Poland in 1623 from 3 years of captivity in Constantinople. He was around 30 years old. He had fought his first battles before the age of 20. He had been at Chikora, had survived the retreat, and had watched everything fall apart in the worst possible way. Not because the plan was wrong, but because discipline collapsed at the critical moment. He knew what a table formation was supposed to do, and he knew how it could fail. He came back to a frontier that was chronically underfunded and undermanned. The same, whatever it said in formal sessions about the importance of the southeastern borderlands, was reliably reluctant to spend actual money on permanent garrison forces. Koniecpolski had to work with what he had, which was never quite enough. His defining quality was not courage. Every hetman in Commonwealth service needed courage. It was the willingness to spend an enormous amount of time thinking about what the enemy would do before deciding what he himself would do. He did not plan to beat the Tatars by fighting them on their terms. He planned to make them fight on his. In the spring of 1624, Khan Temir, a senior Crimean military commander, not the Khan of Crimea himself, but the leader of a major independent horde, organized another raid into the Commonwealth's borderlands. This was not unusual. It was what the Crimean leadership did every season that seemed favorable. Khan Temir was not an impulsive raider. He was an experienced commander who had done this before, who understood that speed and unpredictability were his best protection against Polish reaction forces, and who had no intention of letting himself be caught in a set-piece engagement with a prepared enemy. Koniecpolski gathered what forces he could. His army was, by any fair accounting, inferior in numbers. At first, when the horde was still moving north and spreading out to raid, he could only shadow it and carry out delaying actions, harassing the edges, protecting what he could, but not strong enough to stop it directly. He waited. He was waiting for the horde to turn around. One important note on the numbers. Contemporary sources estimated the Tatar force at 15,000 riders. The Polish historian Leszek Podhorodecki, who wrote the most detailed biography of Koniecpolski in the 20th century, drawing on period sources, called that figure a gross exaggeration. The real Tatar strength was almost certainly lower, but it was still substantially larger than the 5,000 men Koniecpolski had assembled by the time the horde began its return south. Whatever the precise ratio, the Polish force was the underdog. That much is not in dispute. By June, Khan Temir's horde was laden and moving south. It had done what it came to do. Now it needed to get home. Koniecpolski received his intelligence. The horde was turning back. He began to move. The village of Martynów, Nowy Martyniv in modern Ukrainian, sits on the Dniester River in what is now Ivano-Frankivsk Oblast, about 35 kilometers from the regional center of Ivano-Frankivsk. In the 17th century, this stretch of the Dniester Valley was part of the Crown's Ukrainian borderlands, the Galician frontier, the edge of the settled world before the steppe took over. The geography here matters enormously, and Koniec Polski understood it. The Dniester, as it winds through this region, runs between two very different types of terrain. The western bank, where the village of Martynów sits, is elevated, high, hilly ground with ridges and rises that give a clear view down the valley and across to the eastern approaches. The eastern bank, where the horde was coming from, is lower and flatter. When the Tatars approached the river on their return march, they would be moving across open ground, visible from the high western bank for a considerable distance, with nowhere to hide their approach. But the critical point was not visibility. It was choke point control. The Dniester at Martynów offered one of the fordable crossings in this stretch of the river. A ford, a place shallow enough and firm enough to cross large numbers of men, horses and livestock. For a horde carrying thousands of roped captives, driven cattle and laden pack animals, this was not a detail. A river crossing for a laden column is a massive logistical operation. You cannot tell 20,000 horses and cattle and several thousand roped captives to simply swim across a river. You need the ford. You need solid footing, manageable current, and enough width to feed the column through without total chaos. Koniec Polski identified the Martynów crossing as the most likely route. He also identified the alternate crossings, the other places where the horde might try to get across the river if the direct route was threatened or blocked. And then he acted on both pieces of intelligence simultaneously. He sent detachments, including mobilized local peasants, elements of his light cavalry and portions of the noble levy, to block or threaten those alternate crossings. Not necessarily strong enough to fight off the entire horde, but enough to make it costly and slow to try. Enough to make the Martynów ford look like the path of least resistance. If you control where the enemy has to go, you have already won half the battle. The Martynów position itself was set up with the Tabor as its anchor. The Tabor formation was something the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had used in various forms for decades. The basic concept was straightforward. Wagons arranged in a defensive perimeter, with infantry and artillery inside, creating a fortified fighting position that could absorb cavalry charges without breaking. At the Battle of Chikora in 1620, Żółkiewski had used a tabor during the catastrophic retreat. It had worked tactically until the army's internal discipline collapsed and men abandoned the formation. Koniec Polski had watched that failure from inside it. At Martynów, he was not using the tabor as a marching formation. He was using it as a prepared ambush platform, dug in, stationary, positioned on the reverse slope of the high ground where it would not be immediately visible to approaching Tatar scouts, but would be within effective range of the ford and the valley floor. The infantry, all 350 of them, and the light cannons were positioned here. They would not move. They would wait. The force he had assembled came to roughly 5,000 men in total, and it was a genuinely mixed force that reflected how the Commonwealth fought on its southeastern frontier. The 600 winged hussars were the elite, the heavy cavalry, the shock arm. These were not ordinary horsemen. The hussar was armoured, a light cuirass, arm braces, a helmet, carrying a lance between 4.5 and 6 meters long, with a silk pennon attached below the point, a long thrusting sword called a konsets under his left thigh, a broadsword and sabre as backup, and sometimes pistols. The horse was a specially bred animal, trained extensively, capable of sustaining a full gallop while carrying a fully equipped rider in tight formation. A hussar charge worked because of the lance, specifically because the combination of weight, speed, and a 6-meter lance delivered to a close-packed formation was physically devastating in a way that almost nothing could withstand. At the moment of impact, each hussar was a narrow column of iron moving at full speed, and the lance reached the target before the horse ever got there. But the hussars were expensive to equip and relatively few. The 2,000 Cossack cavalry, both the registered Cossacks in Commonwealth pay and additional Cossack horsemen, formed the flexible backbone. They fought with sabres, firearms and bows, lighter than hussars, and more suited to the kind of fluid skirmishing that a Tatar engagement required before the decisive moment. The 1,450 other light cavalry were similarly equipped, drawn from the borderland nobility and experienced frontier fighters. Among his subordinate commanders, Koniecpolski had Stefan Chmielewski, one of the most experienced anti-Tatar operators on the entire frontier. Samuel Lashch, a ferocious border fighter who was as comfortable raiding as defending, and a young junior officer named Stefan Czarniecki, who was filing away everything he saw. Against all of this, the Tatar force was larger but structurally constrained. It was almost entirely cavalry, armed with the composite bow, the sabre and the rope. No infantry, no artillery, no siege equipment of any kind. Its power lay in speed, numbers, and the ability to envelop an enemy and hit him from multiple directions simultaneously. The horse archer on open ground against an unprepared enemy was devastating. Against a prepared position with artillery, he had almost no answer. And the horde at Martynów was not a fresh, unencumbered raiding force. It was a laden, homeward-bound column. The Jasir captives, potentially thousands of them, roped together, had to be guarded. The stolen livestock needed to be driven. The plunder had to be carried. The horde had been on campaign for weeks. The horses were not at their freshest. Khan Tamir's operational freedom was constrained by everything he was carrying. This is the situation Koniecpolski was working with. His plan had 3 interlocking components, and each one depended on the others. First, route denial. Block every other viable crossing on this stretch of the Dniester, making Martynów the only practical option. Force the horde into the funnel. Second, deception. Once the horde approached the Martynów position and saw Polish forces on the high ground, those forces would appear to be retreating in disorder. Koniecpolski would order the high ground abandoned in a staged, visible withdrawal, with supply wagons left scattered on the hillside. Real food, real supplies, left as bait, suggesting that the Poles had been surprised and were running. Khan Tamir was a smart commander. He would not charge blindly. But he was also a commander with a laden column that needed to cross the river, and if the high ground appeared undefended and the enemy appeared broken, the temptation to attack would be enormous. Third, the ambush itself. The Tatar attack would be absorbed by the Cossack cavalry and light horse, not the hussars, not yet, in a fighting retreat back toward the Tabor's position. Then, as the Tatars pursued, Koniecpolski would withdraw again, drawing them into range of the artillery and infantry in the wagon fort. Once the artillery had done its work on the pursuing mass, disordering it, bloodying it, stripping away its momentum, he would commit all 12 korongvi of cavalry in a single coordinated charge. Everything at once. No reserves held back. The risk in this plan was not obvious, but it was real. It required the Polish cavalry to absorb a Tatar charge without actually breaking. It required them to feign a retreat that looked genuine enough to convince an experienced Tatar commander, but was controlled enough to maintain unit cohesion. And it required Khan Tamir to take the bait twice. Once when the high ground was abandoned, and once when the Poles appeared to pursue and then withdrew a second time. The evening of June 19th, as the horde moved toward Martynów, Koniec Polski completed his preparations. He positioned the tabor behind the ridgeline, out of sight from the valley floor, but close enough to have effective cannon range once the action moved back toward it. He placed the supply wagons on the hillside, scattered in a way that would look like hurried abandonment, not neat, not organized, but not obviously false either. He positioned his cavalry formations behind the high ground, visible to the horde's scouts, but appearing uncertain, milling, perhaps caught off guard by the horde's timing. Somewhere in that camp, the horses were being checked and tended. Weapons were being prepared, lance tips, saber edges, powder charges for the light guns. The infantry in the tabor were loading their pieces and checking their positions. The 600 hussars were doing what hussars always did the night before, checking that every piece of equipment was in order, because in the charge that was coming, a broken lance or a misfitting arm bracer was the difference between living and dying. Across the valley, from the high ground, you could hear the horde. The sounds carried in the cool night air, the noise of thousands of horses, the occasional cry of a child in the jassier column, the calls of Tatar outriders communicating across the dark. The captives were down there. They had been walking for days or weeks. Some of them, perhaps, could hear the Polish camp in return and did not know what it meant, could not know whether the soldiers on the other side of the valley were there to fight for them, or to trade with their captors, or to simply watch. Koniec Polski knew they were there. The jassier was one of the things that made this battle different from a purely military engagement. He was not just trying to stop the horde, he was trying to get those people back, and that meant the battle had to be decisive. A partial victory, a horde that retreated in good order with its captives intact, was not enough. He needed to destroy it. Dawn came grey and soft over the Dniester Valley on June 20th, 1624, and the mist was still on the river. Koniec Polski had been awake. It would be strange to imagine he had slept much. His scouts had tracked the horde's movements through the night, and the intelligence was clear. Khan Tamir's force was moving toward the Martynów ford. The alternate crossings were blocked or threatened. The funnel was working. He gave the order to begin the deception. The Polish cavalry on the high ground, the units visible to the Tatar scouts watching from the valley floor and from the far bank, began to move. Not in the organized, disciplined fashion of a force preparing to fight. They moved with what was meant to look like uncertainty and disorder. Units shifted position without apparent purpose. Riders moved back and forth across the ridgeline. And then, visibly, the Polish cavalry began to fall back from the high ground, pulling away from the ridgeline and retreating down the reverse slope. They left the wagons. Scattered across the hillside, not stacked neatly or guarded or organized in any fashion that suggested deliberate positioning, were supply wagons. Real ones, with real food and real supplies. The kind of thing an army drops when it is moving in a hurry and does not want to deal with the encumbrance. The kind of thing that tells an observant commander, these men were caught off guard and left in a panic. It was entirely manufactured. Every man in that withdrawal knew exactly what he was doing and exactly where he was going. behind the ridgeline, into the prepared positions, where the Tabor sat quiet and loaded and waiting. But from below, from across the valley, it looked like an army that had been surprised and was running. Khan Temir saw it. His scouts reported it. And here is where his reputation as a careful and experienced commander becomes relevant. Because he did not simply charge. He observed. He processed. He had been in the Commonwealth's borderlands before. He had dealt with Polish forces before. He knew that a tactical withdrawal could be a trap. And he was not the kind of raider who threw his force at the first opportunity without thinking. But he also had a laden column. He had thousands of horses, thousands of captives, stolen cattle, looted goods. Every hour he spent on the northern side of the Dniester was an hour he could not afford. His horses were eating. His men were exposed. The ford was right there. The high ground above it appeared abandoned, and the Polish cavalry seemed to be in retreat. By early morning, Khan Temir committed. The horde began to move. What came across that valley floor was not a disorganized mob. A Tatar raiding force in full attack was a disciplined cavalry charge by thousands of riders who had been doing this their entire adult lives. The composite bow was a weapon of genuine range and accuracy, and Tatar horse archers shooting from a moving mount at a moving target were among the most technically skilled soldiers in the world. They came forward fast, the way they always did, spreading wide to hit multiple points simultaneously, the centre pushing toward the high ground while wings began to reach around the flanks. Archers in the front ranks shooting on the move to suppress and disorder the enemy before the mass of riders hit. The Polish cavalry did not run. They met the attack. But it was not the hussars who absorbed the first impact. It was the Cossack cavalry and the light horse. The 2,000 riders who formed the middle of Koniec Polski's force. Experienced border fighters who understood exactly what was being asked of them. They needed to fight, trade real casualties, give real ground, and not break. Not actually break, though they were meant to look like they were breaking. The fighting in that first engagement was brutal and genuine. Horse archery at short range means arrows going through men and through horses. Sabre exchanges at close quarters, the Polish cavalry pulling back step by step, the Tatars pressing forward. The sounds of the battle, shouting, the crash of horses meeting horses, the shriek of wounded animals, filling the valley. For nearly an hour this went on. Koniec Polski watched it from behind the ridgeline. He could see enough to read it. His cavalry was doing what it was supposed to do, fighting, bleeding, retreating, holding together. Khan Temir was pushing harder, committing more of his force. The apparent disorder on the high ground, the abandoned wagons, the retreating cavalry, it all reinforced the picture of an enemy force that was falling apart. Then the Tatars pulled back. It is not entirely clear why, whether losses in that first hour reached a point where Khan Temir wanted to consolidate, or whether his commanders urged caution before crossing the high ground, or whether it was simply the tactical pause that experienced cavalry commanders take before pushing for the decisive blow. Whatever the reason, the horde broke off the initial engagement, and the valley went relatively quiet. Koniec Polski moved immediately. He sent cavalry forward, not to press a decisive attack, but to appear to pursue. The Polish riders advanced from behind the ridgeline, moving fast toward the Tatar positions, and the Tatars saw it and did what cavalry does when it is harassed by a moving enemy force. They turned and came back. The pursuit turned into a countercharge, and the Polish cavalry turned and ran. This was the second deception, the harder one, the one that required genuine nerve and timing. The Poles ran back toward the Tabor, and the Tatars chased them, and the chasing mass of Tatar riders swept forward at full gallop, pressing hard, closing the gap, certain now that the enemy was breaking. And then the Tabor opened fire. The light cannons fired first. The sound in a narrow valley with hills on both sides is not the same as cannon fire in an open field. It compresses, bounces, hits you from multiple directions at once. The iron shot tore through the front ranks of the pursuing cavalry. Horses went down. Riders went down. The formation buckled. Then the infantry fired. 350 men behind wagon walls, with their pieces already loaded and aimed at the approach line, the Tatars were now running straight into. The effect of prepared artillery and massed infantry fire on a cavalry force that has been caught at short range, already at the gallop, with no room to turn and no way to respond, is not complicated. It is catastrophic. The front of the Tatar pursuit simply collapsed. Horses piling into fallen horses, riders thrown or trapped. The press of riders behind them pushing forward into the carnage because there was no room and no time to stop. Khan Temir had no artillery. He had no infantry. He had no answer to a prepared position with cannon at close range. This was the fundamental structural weakness of a force built entirely around speed and mobility. It had no tools for the moment when speed and mobility ran headlong into a wall of iron and fire. The mass of the pursuing Tatar cavalry was disordered. Not destroyed, not routed, but bloodied, shocked, the formation broken open, the momentum gone. Koniec Polski had been waiting for exactly this moment. He gave the signal. All 12 chorągwi of Polish cavalry moved at once. Every banner, every unit, the hussars at the front, 600 of them, coming over the ridgeline or around the flanks of the Tabor at full speed, lances down, formation tight, and behind them the Cossack horse and the light cavalry following in the same mass. 12 banners. Every man, no reserve. The hussar charge at full speed covered the distance fast. There is a physical reality to what 600 armoured lancers do to a disordered formation that has just been hit by artillery and is still trying to reform and does not have time. The lance reaches the target before the horse does. A man on a horse with a 6-metre lance, moving at full gallop, covers an enormous amount of space in a very short time. And when that lance hits a man or a horse, it does not stop. The riders behind are already coming. The formation does not slow down. The Tatar line broke. It did not bend or retreat in order. It broke. Khan Temir was somewhere in that mass, and at some point in the fighting he was wounded. His personal condition matters here, because a commander who is wounded and whose formation is collapsing has almost no capacity to reorganize or direct a controlled withdrawal. The command structure fractured with the fighting line. And then the horde ran. South. Toward the Dniester. Toward the ford at Martynów. They ran because there was nowhere else to go. The alternate crossings were blocked or threatened. The high ground was behind them, held by the enemy. The valley funneled them toward the river, and the river was at the end of the valley, and the ford was at the village. The Polish cavalry followed them all the way. A pursuit after a broken cavalry force is not a clean military operation. It is fast and chaotic and lethal. The pursuers have the advantage of momentum, and the pursued have only speed. And when speed runs out, when the horses tire, when the ground gets bad, when the river appears, speed is no longer enough. The ford at Martynów was not built for this. A ford that can manage an organized column of horses crossing in sequence cannot manage thousands of terrified riders all trying to cross at the same moment. The approaches to the ford were narrow. The riverbank on that side had wet ground, soft ground, the kind of footing that a horse at full gallop finds unpredictable and treacherous. Horses went down in the mud at the bank. Other horses, coming in from behind at speed, crashed into them. Riders were thrown into the water. Some made the crossing. Many did not. The Dniester in June is not a gentle stream. It runs with purpose. A man in armour who goes into the water unexpectedly and cannot get a foothold does not come back up easily. Tatars drowned in the river. Tatars died in the mud at the bank. Tatars were caught by the Polish cavalry in the press and cut down before they ever reached the water. Khan Temir himself made the crossing, wounded but alive, but the horde that crossed the Dniester that afternoon was a shattered remnant of what had arrived that morning. By nightfall on June 20th, the battle was over in any meaningful sense. The pursuit continued into the early hours of June 21st, the Polish cavalry following the scattered survivors south, hunting down Tatar riders who had gotten across the river but could not outrun their pursuers in the dark. And through all of this, as the battle played out from the deception phase, through the cavalry engagement, through the artillery ambush, through the decisive charge, through the rout and the crossing, the people in the Jassier column were there. They had been marching with the horde. When the horde broke and ran, their guards went with it, or died where they stood. The ropes were left behind. The captives were there in the valley, in the chaos of a routed army, and the Polish cavalry, as it pushed through and past them in pursuit, cut the ropes. People who had been marching toward the slave markets of Kaffa were standing free in a Galician valley in the summer of 1624, while the force that had taken them drowned in the river behind them. The pursuit ended on the night of June 20th to 21st. Koniec Polski pulled his force back. The battle was finished. Dawn on June 21st came over a valley that looked very different from the morning before. The hillside above Martynów, where the supply wagons had been scattered as bait, was now a landscape of battle wreckage. Dead horses on the approaches to the Tabor's position, dead riders in the grass where the artillery had caught them. The scattered wagons, still there, surrounded now by the aftermath of the trap they had helped set. Down near the river, at the ford and on both banks, the water had done its work, and the mud had done its work, and the Dniester was not clean. The exact casualty figures from Martynów do not survive with the precision that modern historians would prefer. No detailed Polish battle report with counts on both sides has come down to us. What we know is descriptive rather than numerical. The Tatar force was shattered, the horde effectively destroyed as a functioning military unit, and the losses were severe enough that the victory was recognized by contemporaries as the greatest Polish success against the Tatars in 100 years. Polish losses, given the nature of the engagement, a prepared ambush, a deception that worked, a cavalry charge against an already disordered enemy, were substantially lower, though not nothing. The hour of fighting in the first phase had cost men and horses. What is clear is that the result was comprehensive. This was not a tactical success where the enemy retreated in reasonable order and would be back next season. The horde that crossed the Dniester that afternoon was a broken remnant, not a force capable of reorganizing and raiding again anytime soon. The Jassir column that had moved through this valley for the past weeks was now free. This outcome deserves a moment of attention because it was genuinely unusual. In the vast majority of Tatar raids on the Commonwealth's borderlands, even in cases where Polish forces eventually intercepted the retreating horde and inflicted real damage, the captives were usually gone. They moved faster than the response. They crossed the Dniester ahead of any relief force. They were already on the steppe, already in Crimea, already sold and distributed to buyers across the Ottoman world by the time the Polish army could do anything about it. The window for recovery was almost always too small. Koniec Polski had closed that window on purpose. The entire architecture of the plan, the route blocking, the force channeling toward Martynów, the ambush at the crossing, was designed not just to destroy the military force, but to do it before the crossing, before the people in those ropes got to the other side of the river. He succeeded. The pursuit that followed the route recovered most of the captives. People who had watched their villages burn and had been walking in a rope line for days or weeks went home. Khan Temir survived. He crossed the Dniester wounded. The exact nature of his wound is not recorded in detail, only that he was hurt in the fighting. He made it south. He got back to Crimea. But a commander who leads a horde to something close to annihilation does not maintain his standing in the Crimean political world easily. The authority and influence he had held before June 1624 did not survive the aftermath. The Crimean Khanate operated on a system of prestige and demonstrated capability. A Murza, or senior commander, was powerful because he won, because he brought back Jassir, because his men wanted to follow him. Khan Temir came back from Martynów with almost nothing, and with the story of what happened at the ford following behind him. His influence among the Tatars declined after the battle. It is a quiet ending to a commander who had been, before June 20th, one of the more capable and feared operators on the Commonwealth's border. He disappears from the major sources not long after. Koniec Polski's position, by contrast, was dramatically enhanced. He brought his force back from the Dniester Valley and sent his reports to Warsaw. The Sejm, which was not in the habit of enthusiastic praise for anything, formally thanked him. This was not a ceremonial gesture. It was an institutional recognition that something exceptional had been accomplished. King Sigismund III, whose relationship with his hetmans was complicated by the usual dynastic and political manoeuvring that characterized Commonwealth court life, rewarded Koniec Polski with the post of Palatine of Sandomierz. He was, at this point, around 30 years old, 2 years out of Turkish captivity, and already the most celebrated field commander in the Commonwealth's southeastern theatre. The young Stefan Czarniecki, who had been present as a junior officer, doing what junior officers do, following orders, watching how the whole thing was managed, would carry the memory of Martynów forward for the rest of his career. He would fight for Poland for another 40 years. He would be remembered, eventually, as one of the greatest commanders in Polish history. He was at Martynów in the summer of 1624, learning. The battle at Martynów did not end the Tatar raids. This needs to be said clearly, because the temptation in telling a story like this is to conclude that the victory solved the problem, and it did not. The Crimean Khanate was not destroyed at a ford on the Dniester on June 20th, 1624. Khan Temir lost his influence and his horde lost its cohesion, but the Khanate's structural capacity for raiding, the horses, the trained riders, the slave market economy, the Ottoman backing, remained intact. The raids continued. They continued for more than a century after Martynov, well into the 18th century, until the Russian Empire finally dismantled the Khanate in 1783. The southeastern frontier of the Commonwealth remained, as it had always been, a borderland where the price of settlement was permanent vigilance and periodic catastrophe. What Martynov changed was not the strategic reality of the frontier. What it changed was the understanding of what was tactically possible against the Tatars, when a commander combined terrain control, deception, and combined arms in the right sequence. Before 1624, the conventional Polish defensive approach to the Tatar problem was reactive. You learned that a horde was coming, you mobilized what you could, you tried to slow it down, and sometimes you caught a piece of the retreating column and won a skirmish. Decisive victories were rare, to the point of being remembered for generations, which is exactly why contemporaries noted that Martynov was the greatest success in 100 years. The default outcome was that the Tatars raided, took their captives, crossed the river and disappeared into the steppe before the Commonwealth could concentrate enough force to stop them. Koniec Polski had demonstrated a different approach. The key was not greater numbers. He never had greater numbers against the Tatars, and he never would. The key was that he treated the enemy's return route as a weapon. He understood that a laden, homeward-bound horde carrying its plunder was qualitatively different from the fast-moving raiding force that had come in, and he designed his entire operation around that difference. Route denial forced the horde into a specific corridor. Deception brought the horde to the prepared position on Polish terms rather than Tatar terms. The tabor and artillery neutralized the one tactical advantage the Tatars had: the ability to use their mobility to avoid fighting at a disadvantage. And then the cavalry charge finished what the artillery had begun. The officers who fought at Martynov took those lessons with them. Stefan Czarniecki would go on to command Polish forces in the catastrophic wars of the mid-17th century: the Khmelnytsky Uprising, the Swedish Deluge, the wars with Russia. He would become famous for exactly the kind of aggressive, terrain-aware, combined arms thinking that Martynov had demonstrated. He was in that valley in 1624. He watched how it was done. Koniec Polski himself applied the same philosophy of choke point control to permanent infrastructure. In 1635, he ordered the construction of the fortress of Kodak on the Dnieper, designed to dominate the river at a critical point and give the Commonwealth permanent control of a key corridor into the steppe. The strategic logic was identical to Martynov: identify the place the enemy must pass through and control it. The fortress was stormed and destroyed by Cossacks later that year and had to be rebuilt, which tells you something about the difficulty of the broader southeastern problem. But the thinking behind it was sound. The Sejm's formal recognition of Martynov mattered in ways beyond the ceremonial. It demonstrated, at least briefly, that the Commonwealth's notoriously underfunding political class could recognize a genuine military achievement and reward it. It also established Koniec Polski's authority in a way that transcended normal political friction. He would go on to fight Tatars again in 1633 and again in 1644. He would fight the Swedes in Prussia for years. He would manage the Cossack question on the frontier with a combination of force and negotiation that delayed the catastrophic Khmelnytsky uprising, which came just 2 years after his death in 1646. There is a particular quality to Martynov that goes beyond its tactical elegance. The battle was won by a man who, 2 years earlier, had been sitting in a Turkish dungeon with plenty of time to think. He had watched the battle that put him there, Chekora, 1620, fall apart not because the plan was wrong, but because the execution failed at a critical moment. He knew what it looked like when a clever plan collapsed. He spent 3 years thinking about it. When he came back, he did not design a plan that required perfect discipline under pressure. He designed a plan that accounted for the pressures that break discipline, and he used the enemy's own tactical instincts against him. Khan Temir charged, because charging is what Tatar cavalry does. Koniecpolski made sure that charging looked like the right decision for long enough, and that when the Tatars realized it was not, it was already too late to do anything about it. The most powerful army in a battle is not always the biggest one. At Martynov, it was the one that decided where the fighting would happen, and when, and on whose terms. Centuries later, the valley at Novi Martyniv is quiet. The ford on the Dniester is still there. The hills above it are still there. And if you stand on the high ground above the river on a June morning, with mist on the water and the sound of the current below you, you are standing exactly where Koniecpolski stood. The man who came back from a dungeon in Constantinople looked at a map of the Galician borderlands and decided that the Tatars would not choose the ground that day. And if you're still here right now, honestly, that means something. It means some part of this landed with you, and I think I know why. Koniecpolski didn't win at Martynov because he had more men. He won because he refused to fight on the enemy's terms. He took the worst possible situation, outnumbered, under-resourced, commanding a frontier that nobody in Warsaw wanted to properly fund, and he turned it into the greatest Polish victory in a century. Not through luck, through the willingness to think clearly when everything around him was uncertain. And here's what stays with me about that. The Stoics used to say that the obstacle is the path, that the thing standing in your way is not separate from your journey, it is your journey. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the impediment to action advances action, and what stands in the way becomes the way. Koniecpolski lived that in 1624. 3 years in a dungeon didn't break him. It gave him time to think. Whatever valley you're standing in right now, whatever horde is coming toward you, you get to choose the ground. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next.